a really, really warm welcome to everybody, and particularly to the group who have come through the TGSS, the Tibetan Graduate Students Organisation. Welcome to the Pitt Rivers Museum, and welcome to everybody in the room. I have to make some practical announcements, which I've been reminded of thanks to Yvonne, who's been looking after us all tonight. Thank you very much, Yvonne. Which is one, if an alarm goes off, it is real, which means that we would have to leave this room by that door and go straight out the back into the rain, I'm afraid. It's unlikely to happen, but just I'm afraid that is a formal requirement that I remind you that if an alarm does go off, then it's a genuine alarm rather than practice. So that's about the first thing. Another important practical matter, if you need the facilities for the loos, they are, and thanks to all of you for coming. This is a special evening because we are really delighted to say that we have all of you here, and we have this combined group of students and others interested in Tibet from the point of view of the Oriental Institute and the teaching in this university on Tibetan and Himalayan studies. And then we also have a group of students in visual, material and museum anthropology, and my colleagues who teach on that degree. Now, and others of you who probably cross over in those ranges of interests. So in giving this little introductory talk to the exhibition, I'm kind of conscious that there are two rather different groups of interests and different groups of sort of specialisations in my audience. So that's a nice challenge for me to start with. Anyway, what I'm going to try and do now is give you, hopefully, an introduction to the exhibition that we have on display in the Pitt Rivers right now, that will cover some of the ground for both of those groups of you within the audience. And then we'll have the opportunity to actually go and see the exhibition, have some drinks and have some discussion within the space. So it's also, I should say, a kind of celebration of the end of term for all our students. So it's really great to be able to do that in the space of the Pitt Rivers Museum. And my thanks to TGSS for proposing this idea and making it happen. So, okay, I've taught my talk, and by the way, this is an informal talk rather than a formal academic presentation. So it is kind of, from my point of view in this case, really as a curator, although in any project like this, particularly in a university museum of anthropology, the kind of work that we do in the public space, in the space in which we interact with the public, is often, of course, the product of research and sets of relationships that go on. In my case, have been going on for quite a few years, and certain research agendas that I've been pursuing for quite a long time. So I wanted to start, though, first and foremost, by acknowledging my co-curator, my friend, and the artist behind this show, Nyema Droma, who is, if not here physically in the room, is going to be is present with us. I thought at least we could indicate that by a portrait of her, which is pertinent, of course, because this whole exhibition is about portraiture, and portraiture primarily by Tibetans and of Tibetans. By one particular Tibetan, that is Nyema herself, of course. So Nyema knows this talk is happening this evening and is sending her best wishes to everybody, and is very much co-present as well as my co-curator. She's actually, of course, much too busy at the moment doing what she does, which is many, many things. She's a photographer, she's an artist, she's an entrepreneur, she's a designer, she's running 2 businesses back in Tibet. As you can see here, she's doing glamorous things like doing photo shoots, fashion photo shoots in the desert area in Tibet, possibly right as we speak. So one of the things that's been interesting about this project, in fact, is that it has been an exercise, as I said, that we characterise as a kind of co-curation, meaning a collaborative activity. But of course, that's been conducted over thousands of miles, 4,000 or so miles between here and Lhasa, where she was based when we started the project. But Nyema has been coming back here to the Pitt Rivers and then going back and creating work for us back in her home locations. I'll talk about that a little bit as we go through. So, this is not, as I said, a formal lecture, but as my students will know, I just want to give some key themes that I'll be thinking about as I'm going through this talk, and that might help to flag up ideas for you as I go through. The first is that this is a talk basically about something that we construed as a site-specific artwork. It's an installation, an intervention in a historic museum environment. So we're doing something in a very particular place with a very particular history, meaning, of course, the Pitt Rivers Museum. It's also, and these are some of the things I think that are innovative and relatively unusual about this show, it's also an engagement with archives and collections. And one of the points about this activity was to make archives and collections, i.e. objects and photographic material that are usually behind the scenes in a museum like this one, evident to the public, and particularly evident to Nyema. So Nyema worked very closely with our collections in the course of this project. The other thing that's one of our kind of primary ambitions and intentions in the museum in general at the moment, and this is a theme that's across the board now in particularly museums of anthropology, is a notion of, as I've said, co-curation and the idea of agency. And that is to try to ensure in this particular case that contemporary Tibetan culture and identities are foregrounded in this kind of work. So as you will hear, of course, this is work created by a Tibetan artist and in collaboration, her collaborations with members of what she calls the second generation of Tibetans that's born after 1959 in Tibet and China and in the diaspora. The museum also we like to think of in a very different way from the time when this museum was created back in the 19th century, where it was more of a kind of didactic space perhaps. We think far more now, we like to think anyway, of museums as social spaces, as a kind of contact zone in which relationships are established and created with multiple different groups of people, and in which ideas about representation and recognition, empowerment and so on are foregrounded in the way that perhaps museums of anthropology have not done so much in the past. So those are my themes that I hope are going to run through what I'm going to say. But I thought I should at least, I'm afraid I have to go back to one of my kind of earlier works, which is this book that I wrote called The Museum on the Roof of the World, Art, Politics and the Representation of Tibet. Because in order to draw out what I think is particularly interesting maybe and innovative about the exhibition we've done here, which may not be immediately apparent to the public, but which I can talk to you about here, is that exhibitions of any sort, of course, are produced in relationship to what has preceded them. And of course they operate in a kind of transnational space as well, with consciousness of other kinds of exhibitions that may have gone on in other places, as well as things that went on in the past. And in that book I was particularly interested in the way that in the formulation of museum representations of Tibet in the West, in inverted commas, in the exile community in India particularly, and in the PRC itself. I won't be talking about all of that, you'll be pleased to hear, but I do want to just frame this by referring back to what I consider to be the very beginnings of a particular way of representing Tibet museologically, which actually goes back to an incident, an unfortunate incident in Anglo-Tibetan relations, that's one way of putting it, which is the young husband mission to Tibet of 1903 to 4. In that book, The Museum on the Roof of the World, one of the things I argue in looking at the very, apart from the military intervention that occurred, the deaths that occurred along the way, one of the other particular iniquities of that expedition was the huge quantities of looting that went on of material from Tibetan homes, monasteries, temples and other places along the way as 4,000 British troops marched from British India and reached the Tibetan capital, as it was then, of Lhasa. This is a Tibetan illustration recording that moment, made much later, of course. Now, what happened to those objects was that they then were eventually brought back, actually surprisingly quickly brought back to Britain. So I'm just going to talk about how British museums in particular then museumised Tibet as a result of that particular incident. What happened, very briefly, is that this is actually the first display of Tibetan material in any museum in the world. This part in particular it's part of the Buddhism galleries that were created at the British Museum in 1912. So a little bit after the expedition, but basically this whole section has a sign over it that says objects from the Tibet mission, 1903 to 4. So it's a kind of interesting crossover between an exhibition of the sort of military loot from a particular moment of British colonial intervention in Tibet. But it's also a moment when these objects, I argue, were converted into objects of artistic regard. The Tibetan things of great potency in religious context, within Tibetan context, were converted literally into objects that were primarily to be viewed by others, by outsiders, as objects of beauty, of connoisseurship, and so on. Now that mode was also accompanied by a mode of exhibition which, as my students will know, there are two major modes of exhibition display. One is an in-context kind of display, which is probably what we would characterise this kind of display as, where sets of objects with labels and so on are arranged in rows and so on, versus an in-situ display. An in-situ display is a kind of immersive kind of display where you have the sort of experience as if you were in Tibet. And amazingly, in 1905, that is what L.A. Waddell, the antiquarian to the Young Husband Force, the main man behind the acquisition of thousands and thousands of objects, created at Sydenham at the kind of new version of the Crystal Palace in 1905. He created this, as I say, this immersive display with lots and lots of objects, lots of kind of emphasis on the human remains that are used in Tibetan Buddhist practice, a kind of hyper-exoticism applied to the idea of Tibet. And this, of course, was hugely popular, and hence covered in the newspaper like The Graphic you saw a minute ago, and then here in Punch, a cartoon which says, Lhasa, forbidden city, never opened to the public before. And this poor boy, because he knows that he thinks there's going to be horrors inside this chamber, is extremely reluctant to go inside. What does he say? All right, it isn't anything like the Somali one, is it? He says. This is because of the whole business of world fairs and how, children and adults have been introduced to exotic parts of the world by these immersive kind of displays. Now, one of the things one of the conclusions also that members of this mission then came to in 1903 and afterwards is this kind of comment. In Tibet, this is the Frederick O'Connor, the military senior intelligence officer of the mission, writing in 1905 when he came back from Tibet, and I quote, "In Tibet, dresses, houses, furniture, paintings, ornaments, jewellery, whatever it may be, bears the impress of a country unlike any other country in the world. Every Tibetan, high and low, is a curiosity who ought to be in a museum." Now, obviously that's problematic to us, highly problematic, but that is, I think, a kind of abbreviated characterization of how that kind of exoticism of the colonial period is read off in relation to Tibetans. And that is obviously something that in my publications and in the kind of curatorial work I'm trying to do is trying to get away from that, this notion that Tibetans ought to be placed in a museum in some kind of hyper-curiosity mode. The two modes I just described of display have continued and continue to this day. The one privileging objects as art objects, but relating at least to the ideas of religion. For example, the blockbuster show Wisdom and Compassion that was in London and America toured the world actually in the early 1990s, which again did really the same sort of thing as had happened at the British Museum in 1903 to 4, arranged large number of objects to represent the ideas about Tibetans and their culture through things, but in the absence of Tibetans themselves. Exhibitions like this one, which is now at the Fria Sakla, which is another immersive style of exhibition, basically a reconstructed shrine, taking objects actually from all over the different regions of Tibet and amassing them together to create this kind of high spectacle of Tibetanness in an exhibition space. And then you even have still, this is actually from someone's blog from the University of Reading, of a visitor to the American Museum of Natural History. Many of you will know that museum, I'm sure, which is full of dioramas primarily of fauna, but there are some sections which include human sort of mannequins, the representation of human beings, and in particular there is this very small display of two Tibetans who have been, as Frederick O'Connor said, converted into objects of museum regard. So there's that prehistory, and very, very quickly kind of summarising a huge amount of material about the way that Tibet, conventionally speaking, until relatively recently, has primarily been represented, and that is through the extraordinary religious objects that have come out of Tibet, these dispossessed objects that have been removed over multiple phases of removals to the Western world, and then the immersive mode of trying to reconstruct Tibet. The other thing I wanted to mention, though, because this is an exhibition of photography, is that there are, of course, ways in which Tibet has been represented photographically that also has this long history going back into the 19th century and the colonial period, which I discussed in my other book, Photography in Tibet, in which I went right back and found this is probably the earliest photograph ever taken of anyone, of a practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism, or rather two practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism, from the monastery of Hemis in the Western Himalayas in the mid-19th century. And you'll see straight away, these are just obviously a few very small examples, but again the privileging of religion as the principal mode in which outsiders desire to kind of consume and think about Tibet. But then there's another photographic mode which is really crucial to the exhibition actually next door, which is a particular mode of photography which in anthropology we call type photography, in which individuals are photographed as representatives of their type, in this case representing particularly notions of ethnicity, but it also may be, in this project in particular, this is an illustration from the People of India project from the 1870s, 1890s, in which all the peoples of the Indian subcontinent were documented photographically and kind of classified anthropologically according to ethnicity, but also to caste, religion, work, labour and their labour roles and so on. Now that kind of photography was also applied to Tibetans, because Tibetans were of course living in British India in the Himalayan borderland areas at the time. So Tibetans get framed within that particular anthropological mode and the particular mode of photographic framing from the 19th century onwards. They then get converted, those kinds of, that sort of more scientific kind of mode of photography also has its commercial popularist or popularised mode, which is actually incredibly extensive in the form of things like this, which is actually a postcard from my own collection that was actually produced in India in the late 19th century and replicated and sold in Darjeeling, where of course there was also a big Tibetan Buddhist community, or a reasonable sized Tibetan Buddhist community, and once again you can see this kind of privileging of the notion of the type. Really there is that framing of the individual representing his community, his ethnicity and his religion, but that is done particularly through objects. Again, that will be relevant to what we were doing, Nyema and I, when we were working on this exhibition. And finally, just with one very brief example, so this is utterly, utterly unscientific, I would argue that this kind of, and I do argue in my 2016 book, Photography in Tibet, that this kind of mode of photography to some extent does continue, particularly by photographers who are from outside Tibet, this kind of rather romanticising framing of the Tibetan body in particular ways. So, when I was researching the book Photography in Tibet, one of the things I was really very keen to do was to make sure that I didn't just write yet another book that was basically about how foreigners had particularly thought about Tibet or captured it photographically. In fact, there aren't many books about that subject, but not exactly. But the first two chapters of my book do focus on European photographers, British photographers in particular, and then Chinese photographers and others. But basically, the first two chapters were about outsiders who had photographed in Tibet since the middle of the 19th century, and the thinking about the ways in which they had done that. But I was keen to make sure that, or to ensure that the third chapter of the book would actually cover the way that Tibetans themselves had engaged with the camera, both the products of the camera and actually as photographers themselves. So as I was doing that research, I was particularly fortunate that I met, actually at a contemporary art exhibition of Tibetan art by an artist in London, I met Nyema Droma. And Nyema was at the exhibition opening, and I was introduced to her as a photographer, and she started showing me photographs like this on her mobile phone. So she'd started to produce these kinds of portraits of Tibetans in the PRC, in this photographs taken in Lhasa, in fact in the museum run by her father, which is a museum of mountaineering. Anyway, so she took these kind of photographs in which, as you can see, there's a kind of interesting kind of relationship going on there with kind of objects of global consumption, in this case Budweiser beer. And then she also had been taking photographs because she herself has been highly mobile. She was born in Lhasa, educated in Chengdu, and then came to Britain to study at the Royal College of Fashion, the London College of Fashion. And while she was in London, she started getting this particular interest in the way that Tibetans, who were members of the Tibetan diaspora and who were living in London, self-fashioned according to their experience of being in a highly diverse city like London. So she started producing glamorous pictures like this one, which I thought was actually kind of really interesting and novel way of representing Tibetan identity at this particular juncture. So she was one of a number of other photographers that I wrote about in that book, but Nyema had then had a particular interest in coming to the Pitt Rivers, came to visit the museum, and then in 2017 we were offered a grant to support a Tibetan artist to come work in the Pitt Rivers from a fund called the Origins and Futures Fund. So at that point I then thought it would be fantastic if Nyema could come to the museum and work with us. Okay, I'm now conscious that if I do all these themes, I may not get through everything. So, but I do just want to say, okay, so what we were then working on together as she came to the museum, first of all in the spring of last year, was to develop these things according to these key concepts and aims. First of all, as I said before, we wanted to create a site-specific artwork that would be in this museum with its particular history. We were working on something that was the product of an engagement with a very particular kind of visual archive, which is actually the photographic archive of the Pitt Rivers, which contains, out of 330,000 photographs we have here, about 7,500 that were taken in Tibet and the Tibetan-speaking areas of the Himalayas. We would then want to produce a kind of commentary on the complexities of contemporary Tibetan identity formation, and particularly actually at this point in time, 2018-2019, which, as many of you in the room will know, is 2019, and this month, and literally very soon, March 10th, marks a very significant moment, the creation basically of the Tibetan diaspora on March 10th, when the Dalai Lama, well, after an uprising in Lhasa, the Dalai Lama left Tibet, and hundreds of tens of thousands of others at least have followed him into exile since then. So this exhibition is actually addressing what has happened, what is the situation for Tibetans in the generations after that crucial period of change. The other thing is that within the museum and within anthropology, we are constantly trying to address questions of decolonising museums like this one, of rethinking the way that a museum constructed in the colonial past, with all the kinds of issues that arise from that, can be rethought in the 21st century whilst retaining the kind of 19th century display style that you can see next door, for which the museum of course is famous, or infamous depending on your point of view. As I mentioned earlier, we wanted to work on this notion of co-curation or collaborative intellectual kind of creative process, rather than the idea of the curator of a kind of authority figure, and break those things down. So, and within that process, what we were trying to do was to critique this history of visual representations that I very, very briefly outlined before, created by outsiders and the kind of stereotypes it had generated. And we also wanted to celebrate alternative ways of imagining Tibetan culture from the perspective of Tibetans themselves. And finally, on my list of things, undermine expectations of traditionalism that have dogged not only museums of anthropology for generations, but Tibetans as well. By which I mean, I suppose, particularly in the kind of conflation between the way that museums of anthropology frame communities and cultures according to tradition, and that's how has been the case at least for a long time in the past. But there is that kind of that sort of demand and pressure sometimes in relation to Tibetans as well. So, what did we decide to do? First of all, we decided to make an intervention in the empty space. Now, as you all know, most of you, I imagine, have at least walked through the Pitt Rivers before this artwork was installed within it, but you may not have seen a photograph of it going right back to this is from about 1900. As you know, the museum is famous for its typological display style, and probably even equally famous for the huge numbers of objects that are displayed in the museum today, and still in these Victorian-style cases that you can see here. We have actually done one previous intervention in that space, again working with a Tibetan artist. This was Gonka Gyatso's installation back in 2003, where he made this, as you can see, Union Jack out of Chinese silk brocade, and then created these ribbons of kind of tentacles of colonialism, I like to think of them as, that connected to the cases across the museum and made a kind of critical commentary on the nature of a museum like this. Gonka also started creating the 4 self-portraits that you see on the wall behind you there. But that space, as I said, I think is a particularly kind of, it is, most people perhaps don't even notice that there is this huge empty space in the middle of the museum, because the museum experience is very much about this density of display, this huge number of objects, to the point that some people almost find it claustrophobically object-rich. As actually our colleague here, who's here tonight, where is Chris? Chris Dorset has done all sorts of extraordinary interventions into this space over the years, but we wanted to sort of return to the inspiration that he's given us of trying to kind of creating a dialogue between that empty space and the sets of objects that are in it. The downside, of course, is of many ethnographic museums, and of course you can see in this picture here, is of course the absence of bodies, the absence of persons. Of course, when the public come in, then there are people there, but the key thing that is omitted, and there's in the nature of an ethnographic museum of this period, is that objects are carrying the burden of representing the people from whom the objects came. So the objects are standing in for those people, standing in for the cultures that they are seen to be part of, and their physical presence, their access to those objects, their ability to interpret and engage with those objects is not part of the standard procedure of the institution. So that's again one of the major things that we wanted to try and do, is to bring the presence, and I mean by we, myself and Nyema, bring the presence of Tibetans into a space which actually includes many objects from Tibet, and in fact even includes, I'll show you in a minute, a photograph, one photograph from Tibet. So the idea was to take this empty space and try to kind of insert something into it which would create a kind of rethinking of the space from the point of view of the public. That by using that space and putting something into it, immediately you start to make people aware that actually there is an empty space there, and that it's a kind of void that is good to think with. It also, it took us a long time to do this, but to suspend these portraits in this way, it enabled us to, well, as we walked around the museum many, many times, Nyema and I, we were trying to kind of reposition the museum by making an insertion into the space that would encourage people to look at the museum differently whilst looking at those particular objects. So it was an idea, it was a kind of idea of reorientating people's view of the museum whilst also orientating them to thinking about these particular sets of portraits. Yes, there's the one, there are very few photographs of, within the museum of historic photographs, but they are only ever really used in this way, as you can see here, and this is a case of implements for making sound. The thigh-bone trumpet that has come from Tibet is accompanied by a photograph of showing how that thigh bone should be used in practice. So really photography in this situation is just functioning as a kind of extension of the object or an illustration of its function, rather than something that is about who that person is or anything else. It's yet another kind of, in a way, minimization of the presence of Tibetans themselves. So one of the things we tried to do in this show was to bring out not only, or to insert new images created by a Tibetan photographer of other Tibetans into the space, but we also wanted to make sure that the kind of archival, the photographic legacy that's behind the scenes that she found so interesting to think with, was also physically in the space. So you'll see that we have these digital screens. This one has something like 60 portraits from the collections of the Pitt Rivers that are not normally seen by the public at all. And they are designed to be in some kind of relationship with the portraits that you can really see in the distance there that she's created in the space. So again, it's trying to create this critical kind of interaction, critical dialogue between the historic colonialist kind of framing of Tibetan ethnicity in photographic form with these new inventions that Nyema came up with herself. So yes, the inspiration of the archive. So Nyema came and was in the museum for about a month in the spring of last year. She worked extensively with my colleagues, Philip Grover, Chris Morton and others who curate the photograph collections. And then she and I spent a lot of time together as well, looking at many of the examples from the 7,500 pictures of Tibet were taken by these British colonial civil servants before 1950. So we studied them in the archive, and we looked at their related documentation. We thought about again, particularly this notion of type photography, which is kind of still redolent in many of the photographs that we were looking at, and discussed the problematics of that. So this kind of study, again, where you can see the idea of a kind of the body, the objects, and so on being kind of framed as illustrative of a particular type of person. We then actually, rather than just looking at prints and copies of these images, because we had, Nyema had total access to the archives, we also looked at the physical originals, meaning in this case particularly glass plates. So actually that is a photograph taken, in fact, as a collaboration between Charles Bell and Rapton Lepcha, his Sikkimese aide, when in Lhasa in 1921. The glass plates from that time that they spent nearly a year in Lhasa in 1921 are all sitting here in the Pitt Rivers Museum collections. Amazingly, they survived, and they are extraordinary objects. As objects, they're particularly amazing to look at. So as you can see here, Nyema looked at those plates on a light box, and saw the plates first before looking at the prints of them. But when we did do that, you can see the kind of close focus looking that she's doing there. So here is a print, but I should have actually done it the other way around. Okay, what she looked at first was this, and immediately she said she found this image troubling. Said that it appeared like an apparition. There was something ghostly about the inversion of the body in the negative. And the other thing that she said was then when you compared between the positive, the negative, the positive and the negative, that actually it looked like two different people. Now that particular encounter with these objects, we looked at many of these things, made her, and that particular observation of this kind of two different people sort of produced by the materiality of the thing from which these images are created, turned out to be extremely potent for the way that she then thought about the work that she was going to create for the museum. So it is very much, as I said, a product of an engagement with an archive, and within the archive, a particular set of objects that stimulated the idea about how to make the portraits. Just to introduce then the process that Nyema then went through in order to create these portraits of her generation, basically, second generation Tibetans born after the separation between the Tibetan community of the People's Republic, about 6 million people, and the smaller diasporic community, who are of course also highly significant. Because she herself, as I said earlier, has been a transnational figure, has been within the PRC, and grew up there, but has also been in various parts of Europe and North America, she has been able to sort of shuttle between these two worlds, which is a relatively unusual thing to be able to do. And one of the things she wanted to prioritise, she told me very early on, was that she wanted to recognise both those worlds, both those Tibetan worlds, both those Tibetan communities in both places, and to try and bring them together in this space in the Pitt Rivers in a way that is not possible on the whole in the physical world, due to politics and everything else. So she started off by, this is actually one of the first test shoots that she did in Lhasa. This is a man called Yatta, who is a policeman and also a rapper. This idea of the notion of the kind of positive negative in the physical glass plates that she'd seen in the museum started to be translated into an idea about how identity plays out in relation to two different, at least two primary modes of kind of affiliation, shall we say. And so she started to think about dress and objects and these other things that we'd seen in the typological photographs, and what would happen if she approached some of her friends and collaborators both here and in China, and asked them to have their portraits made in these two different modes. So you have Yatta in his chuba, in a more traditional dress, and you have him in his daily wear. So the other ideas that we have been thinking about in looking at the historical photographs as well was the idea that the photographic studio is a place of negotiation, where the subject and the photographer are obviously in some kind of relationship, and the way that people present themselves to the camera obviously determines, in part, they have some agency in how they determine the product of that photographic encounter, whilst the photographer herself, in this case, also has agency in creating that image. And that came out of looking at things like this, where you've got this photograph which actually turned into a postcard, again from a studio in the Himalayas of Darjeeling, and you can see the kind of accoutrements of the studio. So here is Nyema in one of her pop-up studios that she created in the course of making the work for this exhibition. So she travelled she was here in Britain, she took portraits in Oxford, in London, and then she travelled to Zurich, to Paris, to Amsterdam, and photographed in all those places members of the Tibetan diaspora of the second generation, and then back in Tibet she photographed mainly in Lhasa and in Yushu, two major cities with substantial Tibetan speaking populations. So in each of those cases she created this pop-up studio, and she set up a procedure where we had sort of discussed in advance what she would prepare and what she would ask her subjects to do in preparation for their visit to the photo studio, the pop-up photo studio. So you can see this is a page from one of her kind of instruction sheets to the people for the photo shoot. So here's Namso. He was a personal trainer. He was asked to bring various things, favourite object, pair of wristbands. Yeah, so we asked everybody to bring an object, and then Nyema asked people to bring an item of their daily dress or their normal wear, or the wear that they prefer to be photographed in for their profession, and then something maybe traditional if they wanted to bring a chuba or not. The outcome, by the way, I should mention that in the course of asking those questions, in the course of doing the photo shoot, she also asked a set of questions about how people felt about those objects, why they brought those objects, why they brought those dress items. So we're trying to kind of break down the sort of the processes of the production of type photography by people being able to respond and talk about that. And then she filmed those interviews, which are now, extracts from which are now on display in a very powerful, I think, video that's showing in the exhibition space next door. So now you might like to see the end result. So Namso's photo shoot. He actually decided to wear Thai boxing shorts and his headphones, and was photographed in that mode. And then this is actually a tuba that belonged to Nyema rather than to himself, but I think he brought his mala, the prayer beads, to be photographed in that mode. This idea then was basically played out these kind of against these major dualisms that are, as we all know, in anthropology and in any academic discipline, highly problematic, but just to put them in this basic form for the moment. The notion of the positive-negative then looked into the notion of tradition versus modernity. Related questions were also to do with diaspora versus homeland. But then I've put in the keyword, of course, intersectionality. That there's no such thing, of course, as one kind of identity, and that in most cases, of any one of us in this room, we are in some kind of intersectional kind of status, probably, in terms of our identity. Which is why we use this quote in the exhibition from James Baldwin: identity would be seen to be a garment which one covers the nakedness of the self, in which case it's best that garment be loose. And given that this is an exhibition about dress and a representation through dress to the camera, we thought that was an evocative statement. So in the process of creating these portraits, at one point Nyema did actually think of literally converting all her portraits to negative, to kind of make that connection back to the historic sources. In the end, she decided to continue with as you've seen in Namso's portrait, with this combination of a kind of high colour, very intense, saturated, kind of quite glamorous, contemporary kind of image for one portrait, and then this is actually not particularly muted, but the version in the show is more muted. This muted backdrop, this idea of a kind of blankness, actually relates to the way the objects were exhibited in the museum, particularly in the court, where they are hung in some kind of emulation of prayer flags, the objects that are used in all sorts of places of sanctity and so on in Tibet, where the 5 colours of Tibetan Buddhist cosmology are represented. In our case, what we did at the museum was we chose 4 to be the strong colour backdrops for the front sides of those things, and then on the back, on the reverse, there's this kind of neutral, more monochromatic colour which relates to the white colour of the Tibetan prayer flags. Anyway, so as you can see from these few examples I'm going to show you here, each person came with their different items of dress. Nyendak here is a chef, as you can tell. I don't think that lobster is real, but he's clearly wanted to. That was the suggestion that came up in the studio, and then of course he chose also to bring an item of traditional Tibetan food. So the ideas of the material things as well as the dress played out in those contrasts throughout. And then the setting here from Lhasa has this wonderful outfit with a mask, so very much playing to that notion that all forms of identity, of course, are basically performances, and particularly a performance when it comes to being photographed. And then, well, you can see in the video in the museum, she speaks very confidently about the nature of her sexual identity, and you can see that also in the object she selected for this. This portrait, the contemporary portrait, i.e. the multicoloured flag of LGBTQ. And then I'm not going to say too much about this because I don't want to embarrass Tome, but this is, I think, one of my favourite portraits of the exhibition. Thank you so much. And particularly because of the objects that Tome selected. His gown and robes at the University of Oxford, Melvyn Goldstein's book, a book written in English, talking about the history of Tibet, which you then kind of criticise a bit in the film, right? So saying something about how problematic some of those kinds of accounts by foreigners are in the way they characterise Tibetan history. And then the Pecha, a Tibetan-style book, and Chuba. That I find a particularly poignant combination. Anyway, as I said, I'm now going to move almost to the end of this section, just to say then. So then the idea was that once these portraits had been created, they would then be in a dialogue with one another, and so we inserted them into the court of the museum as you can see on those cables. Yeah, so there you get the idea of the kind of strong, bold colours from the prayer flags. And then the reverse side was this much more kind of bleached out kind of versions in the traditional mode and traditional dress, which also references the negatives and the historical photographs that Nyema had consulted in creating this work in the first place. There are all sorts of really interesting things, I think, to say about that tension between the two sides. It's not for me to say that, I don't think it's not for me to interpret that, but the responses of members of the public in looking at those two sides have been extraordinary and very varied, is all I can say for the moment. So, as I said, we had the installation in the court, that installation in the empty space, that attempt to make a dialogue between the historic museum space and the representation of contemporary Tibetan culture, basically through the work of a Tibetan photographer and the Tibetans that she worked with to create the work. Then we have this more conventional gallery in the just down the corridor from where you are now, at the bottom of which is a video screen where we're showing the interviews that I mentioned, or extracts from those interviews. And I just want to mention those because in many ways they are the most powerful thing in the exhibition, because this is where those who are photographed speak for themselves, and speak in multiple languages, by the way, Tibetan, Chinese, I think there's at least some Swiss German being spoken in one of them, and in other interviews that we didn't feature in the exhibition video in the end, several other languages were in use, which in and of itself is reflecting of the nature of the complexity of diasporic experience in particular, and even within the PRC, obviously, most people are bilingual in Tibetan and Chinese. So all of that comes out, but the questions that Nyema asked people about the objects they brought, the dress that they were wanting to wear, the way they wanted to self-represent to the camera, all sorts of really interesting things came out. So this, for example, is Karma Emchi, who's otherwise known to Tibetans as Shabalay, the famous rapper, but he's also a doctor by day, so his portrait in the gallery shows him in his doctor's, well, at least with his stethoscope, and then in this more traditional style of dress, and in which he comments in apparent. Nyema says his Tibetan, his spoken Tibetan, is more pure and beautiful than most people from Lhasa, although he left Tibet when he was a very small child. But as you can see here, he is commenting on the notion of return and the imagining of what Tibet might be like to go back to. He also said, when asked, what is Tibetan kind of culture or what is Tibetan identity, he just said it's language, it's religion, it's practice, it's custom. Then, on the other hand, you have someone who you don't maybe expect to be particularly wanting to talk about custom and tradition, and she does to some extent. This is Senshul, who's a nun who lives in Yushu. She says our costume and language is something that we should preserve, absolutely. And of course, there she's in this photograph. She's in her nun's dress. But then in her other portrait and in the video, she talks about how she prefers hip hop music these days. So she's a fascinating kind of combination, as many of the people who were photographed by Nyema are, of this interplay between things that are global, like hip hop, and the very specific of the communities from which they live, in whether it's in the PRC or in exile. And then I want to just quote, in fact, from someone who's also in this room tonight, to indicate that overall, as a result, particularly, as I said, in the videos, but also in the interplay between the double portraits, we come across an idea which is only too familiar to us in an academic context, that there is no such thing, of course, as a kind of fixed or pure or rigid definition of any ethnicity, or as Thupten Kesang has put it, of course, no rigid definition of being Tibetan. That identity is a highly fluid, highly complex matter. So I'm really grateful to Thupten for summarising that and putting that in the film so cogently. Right, so finally, just to say, one of the things that I mentioned at the beginning was that this exhibition was supposed to be about creating a kind of space that was a social space, using the museum in a non-didactic kind of way, thinking of the museum as a creative space and a space for interaction between all sorts of people. Any exhibition, of course, in a museum has to be able to work for any member of the public who might come through the door. But it is also, this particular exhibition is designed to have kind of multiple layers and to have particular resonance for members of the Tibetan community should they be able to visit. And in fact, we have created various contexts in which we specifically have encouraged Tibetan visitors into the museum, which I just want to mention. But first of all, so the museum is a social. So Nyema's work has been very well received. It has been displayed not only within the museum, but as you can see here on the November night light, when the Christmas lights are turned on, it was projected right over the front of the Natural History Museum. It has, of course, been stimulating discussion and tweets and various other things through social media and on the internet, with people just encountering her work without any expectations, with just coming to the museum for other purposes and then finding something interesting. It has had, of course, a resonance in particular for those who participated in it. This is Chu Ying, who lives in London, who's a nurse, and whose portrait you can see there, but she's photographed again by Nyema, her very good friend, seeing her portrait in the museum. And so it's had that kind of role of providing a kind of space for recognition and representation of Tibetans, which was particularly evident, in fact, when we did. I'll show you that in a minute. Hold on. So yes, okay. Here's Namso at the opening, the night of the opening of the exhibition, when he was tweeting about his visit to the show. Kesang, who was in a way has become the kind of poster girl of the exhibition. She's on the cover of the book. She's on the poster for the show, and she's very prominently displayed her portrait anyway in the galleries down there. Wrote something very poignant about her own feelings and the ideas that this exhibition had triggered by being part of it. As I said, we also organised various events in collaboration with Tupten. This is actually his installation that he created in the court, which sadly no longer is on display at the moment, but this special exhibition called Tibetan Objects in Transition was part of a workshop we did with Tupten's work and with Nyema Droma's work for the exhibition, for her exhibition, in which teenage Tibetans, about 20 of them, came to do activities within the museum, had a behind-the-scenes experience, and were then able to come to the opening exhibition party on the night of the 13th of October. So finally, one of the most important things to my mind that has come out of this is the responses that we have been given both orally and digitally, and through questionnaires that we're carrying out. We're still monitoring this, but to see how this exhibition has become received in a social sense. And one of the most powerful things to me has been this expression that was used to me on the night of the opening of the show. And actually, it relates to one of the activities that Nyema herself did, in addition to creating the exhibition, when we had the event with the young people, which was called My Tibet Museum. One of the activities for the young people was to have their portraits taken by Nyema, and here you can see one of the young men who was participating in that. Now, in the evening, after the teenagers had been in the museum, the parents then said, I had several parents come up to me and say, we are particularly grateful that there was this opportunity for our young people to come into the museum, and particularly for Nyema's work, because in that dialogue between the traditional and the modern, the mothers particularly of young Tibetan girls and boys were saying this enabled them to see that it was possible to be both, how to be both, that it was possible for them to be Tibetan and to be proud of their Tibetan heritage whilst also being very British. Many of these women were saying to me, we've had great difficulty in encouraging our children to kind of carry on with Tibetan language, to participate in Tibetan kind of cultural activities, because they think it's uncool. But this exhibition, because it's so glamorous, because they recognise people within it, they recognise Chapelet and these other people, has given them a sense of pride and confidence in the notion that it's okay to be both. So in conclusion, the other, of course, the most important person in all of this, and that's made the whole exhibition possible, is Nyema Droma herself. And she created, as you'll see in the exhibition, 2 self-portraits in the process of making the show. She wasn't going to do this to start with, she was just going to photograph everybody else, but I asked her if she would do self-portraits, and actually, in the end, she produced this, I think, these fantastic images. And so here is Nyema in her contemporary dress as a photographer, artist, and all the other many things that she is in Lhasa, with her tattoos on display, a proudly kind of assertive young woman. And then here she is in her traditional dress, but of course in male dress, with her camera, with her fake facial hair. And as you'll see in the exhibition space, she says that she's done this because she thinks that otherwise, one of the stereotypes that she has to deal with on a daily basis is that it's not produced by foreigners at all. It's actually produced by other Tibetans who say, if as a woman you cannot possibly be a photographer, be an artist, or be involved in any of these kind of radical modes of self-fashioning that your work suggests. So I think, well, I know she would say herself that this exhibition process has actually been transformative for her as well. It's allowed her to kind of reposition herself, both as a photographer, and of course she's this exhibition has enhanced her profile, but also in terms of how she rethinks herself. And if I'll close with this picture, this is Nyema in the outfit she wore for the self-portrait, walking the streets of Lhasa and discussing with other young Tibetans in Lhasa about this problematic of kind of gender and identity formation. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.